Welcome to another episode of the Vikingology podcast. I'm co-host number one, CJ Adrian.
And I'm co-host number two, Terry Barnes, and we are the art and science of the Viking Age. And today, I'm super excited for today that you all get to hear from somebody I have come to be hearing from on a frequent basis these days. But we have Professor Alexandra Sandmark, all the way from Scotland. And she is a Viking scholar, actually working like a couple of different really interesting areas. So your PhD is in the Christianization of Scandinavia from University College London. But you also have worked in the Department of Archaeology and Uppsala, and we've had friends of the show from Uppsala. Shout out, Ben. And then also, you're a research fellow at the Institute of Archaeology at the University College London. And then in 2009, made it so that my path would finally cross with yours, where you start working at the University of the Highlands and Islands. And yay, the rest is history, as they say. So, yeah, full disclosure, everyone, Alex is my PhD dissertation supervisor. So, we are working on a project together. But Christianization aside, that's a lovely topic, but we've talked about that a little bit on the podcast before. But today we wanted to talk about the other, I think, kind of main body of your work, isn't it? Sort of, well, pimp the book here. Viking
Mm.
law. I always do this weird mirroring. Viking law and order. And this is my copy of this book is like insane. Like, I don't know. Can't you see that? Or you probably can't.
Yeah. Oh, there you
Yeah,
go.
that's what it's like.
Yeah.
All the notes.
Ah,
Really? You don't use a highlighter? You
that
underline? That's
is a highlighter to underline.
oh.
It's just orange.
Oh.
Yeah, so but this is about the subtitle Places and Rituals of Assembly in the Medieval North. And this is a fun one, I think, just because, well, I'm always telling my students, like, just read the law codes. It sounds like the dumbest, most boring thing you're ever going to do, but it's not. I guarantee you, you're going to find out so much about this culture, whoever it is, right? Just look at what they decide to make illegal, and all of that. So, but it also, your work is about sort of these places and the processes of law and order in the Viking Age in Scandinavia. And so, maybe the first thing then you could do is sort of tell us, was Scandinavia during the Viking Age a lawless barbarian place?
Definitely not, I think is the answer to that one.
What? That's so contrary to the stereotype. Come on.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Well, it's not your fault. It's their fault.
I feel like there's two stereotypes that compete with each other. There's one camp that thinks, oh, they're lawless barbarians, etc. There's another one that's kind of gone too far the other way of saying, no, they had these strict law practices. They're unbreakable, etc., etc. And I'd be interested to hear what's the reality? Where do they meet? Where do they diverge?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, yeah, I mean, as you say, somewhere in the middle, I would say, because they had laws. I mean, or every society has, they had laws and norms, and they have it for conflict resolution. You need to be able to meet with other people and discuss if, whose sheep belongs to whom, or, moving on boundary stones is something that we see a lot in the Norwegian and Icelandic laws, for example. So it's all about resolving conflict. And of course, there was violence and everything. And I think that the assembly, that I've written so much about, the court and the parliament of the Viking Age and the Norse period. I mean, that was kind of the last resort, just like courts today. I mean, you don't go to court until you've seriously fallen out with somebody, and then you end up there because you need some arbitration. And it was the same then, but they definitely had quite firm ideas about how to resolve conflicts and what was their specific law in that, to their area. And then doesn't mean that they can go off and kill people in other areas because they were not under their law code. That's completely different. This was for internal self-regulation, if you like.
I've had students ask me that before. Like, did they, when they went off to raid or trade, or maybe, spent the overwinter or whatever, how did they manage that? Did they take their laws with them, or what was that like?
Yeah, I'm sure they did, because there are so many. I mean, we're working obviously with the medieval laws because we don't have detailed laws from the Viking Age. So we need to project back a little bit. I mean, but in those laws, for example, there are regulations that apply to what happens if you're on a boat, for example. There's no assembly meeting that you can just go to there. How do you decide if there's violence, for example? How do you resolve that? Well, that works as the assembly, so that everyone who's on the boat, they are witnesses, and they can sort of more or less act as the jury there and then. And so they could, because that you need that, don't you? If you're in the middle of the sea and there's a massive argument that breaks out, or there's violence, you need to have some rules on how to resolve that, and they were in place. So absolutely. And they, when they settled the new areas, they took the laws with them as well, the whole system.
So this is a previous setup, isn't it, that is not unique to the Viking Age in Scandinavia? I mean, there's other Germanic traditions with regard to this, and the great word for it, right? The thing, like literally in English, THING, but AKA the public assembly if you're living in the Viking Age. But that was happening with other cultures as well, having to have some kind of periodic gathering, right, in order to deal with these issues. So how much does that, or was that influenced by, say, Roman law then?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I have to admit that I don't know Roman law that well, so I don't really know. I have looked at the other Germanic laws, like the Burgundian laws and some of the Frisian laws, etc. And in there, we can see clear similarities. So that laws that are, from the like 7th, 8th, 9th century. So a long time before the Scandinavian laws that we have, the manuscripts date from like above all the 12th and the 13th century. So that, there's a big time gap there. But it's very clear that these Germanic societies, and of course Roman society as well, I mean, they had parliaments and they had court proceedings. And in terms of the Germanic laws, there are clear similarities. And that, I mean, I'm not trying to say that the Scandinavian thing is kind of completely based on the other Germanic laws and their assembly practices. But I think some of these traditions are long-standing. And as I said, every society needs a way to meet and to decide certain outcomes, whether they're political decisions or whether they, relate to crimes that have been committed, etc., and civil disputes. And there are only so many ways you can do that in a society. So the thing means, really, that the word thing means a meeting that takes place at a specific place and a specific time. And that's it. So in a society where there's no mass media, no mass communication, you need to know that, for example, on Midsummer, a day that's easy to see in the sort of like the calendar, we all meet at this specific place, and that's a big site that everybody knows, and everybody knows to get there at the specific time once a year, for example. That's a very simple setup. When we see that goes across most laws, actually.
So the thing is, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a later phenomenon of the Viking Age, right? Because we have 300 years that we're kind of shooting for. Or because you didn't even use thing, but the first word you used was the practice of assembly. Now I've also heard that the chieftain, in terms of, and I'm thinking of like early Viking Age, like late 8th, early 9th centuries, is that the chieftain was in charge of law and order, had the final say. But then you speak of this practice of assembly. Could you kind of illuminate what that may have looked like for us?
Yes. Yeah. Lots of lots of points in there. I'm going to try and remember them all. First of all, the word thing is really, really old. I'm not a trained linguist or anything, but it does go back to like at least 100 AD. So that word, even though it probably has meant different things at different points in time, but I use thing in assembly kind of interchangeably. I guess I use assembly a lot because people don't know what a thing means, maybe, and it sounds a bit weird. But so yeah, the laws talk about, the thing, but there are also rune stones from the Viking Age. I mean, they are, again, sort of 10th, 11th century, but the thing is definitely mentioned on runic inscriptions as well. And in so further back in time, so Anglo-Saxon society, this word kind of features as well. So it is a really old word. And so the practice of meeting at the thing and holding things predates the Viking Age. Absolutely. Then you asked about the chieftain and the power of the chieftain, I think. Yes. I mean, obviously, another question that I get quite a lot is, was it a democratic society? And I tend to then say, well, a form of democracy. Yeah, like today as well, do we have democracy? Don't we? Who actually influences society and who rules society? So I do think that the powerful in society had more power at the thing than others. That's quite clear. And obviously, if you arrived, you don't mean it meant to use weapons at the assembly, but there are examples. For Egil saga, there's a case when Egil and his companions arrive with weapons to the thing and they cause great damage to it, and that's really illegal because you mustn't bring your weapons to the thing because it's a place of peace and conflict resolution. But this happens a lot, so I think it will depend on also an individual chieftains. How powerful were they? Did they have a number of trusted supporters that would back them up all the time, or and even to the point of using violence, should that be needed? And then they could probably force matters through. If they were weak, they needed people to back them up, and just the fact that the assembly existed, I think, shows that there was not just one person who could rule an area, because think about it, you have meetings that happen at a set place and a regular time of year, and it's there so that people can come and attend. So you and everything that you decide, and all conflicts are resolved, every land purchase that's made at the assembly, everything has to be done in the open so that everybody can see. Because there's no written document, so you need witnesses to see what's happened, what's been decided. So it has to be in this place where everybody is. And for decisions to be accepted, you need at least support of some powerful people or the large majority. So I think it's a sort of give and take a little bit there. That was a long-winded answer. Sorry.
No, it's good. It's good.
No, it's good. I'm just realizing how wrong I got it in my books, but it's okay.
But your books are fiction. Like
yeah. I mean,
books are fiction.
and it's a hero, and he gains followers, right? But he doesn't call assemblies. He doesn't take anyone else's opinion. So
he's very modern. He's progressive.
yeah. Well, I mean, I model him after a modern entrepreneur, right? So it's
Oh, well, I guess to me that also, because I even circled in my notes here the word equality, because this is, one of these misconceptions, preconceptions, however you want to say it, in the modern era, that we get so much. And yet people who study this, no, it's like, no, there is no, it wasn't a feminist paradise. It wasn't like, there isn't legal parity between men and women. It's like, even though we're talking about some sort of decision making by kind of consensus at these public assemblies, it's kind of consensus amongst like the powerful dudes in the room, right? I mean, it's not like everybody gets a vote. Certainly unfree people don't get a vote. Yeah. So it is a very hierarchical structure. And so here's something that I usually say to my students, and so I'll ask you how close I am to the mark, because this is what it feels like to me. I'm in a conflict with somebody. I need to work this out. I want to engage a chieftain. And effectively what I'm going to do is engage a chieftain the same way that if I was having a problem right now in 2025, that I'd go call a lawyer. And I'd be like, all right, you have expertise in actually making the laws or understanding the laws. And so I need you. I'm going to pay you, and you're going to sort of arbitrate or negotiate and help me come, to some kind of, peaceable conclusion to my problem here with this other person. Is that close? Hopefully.
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, first of all, I think it depends on who you are then, because if, say for somebody who doesn't, I guess it depends on some people can represent themselves at the assembly, and others need somebody to represent them. And it also depends on where you are. I think with the situation that you just described fits very much in with what you see in Iceland, where you've got the Gothi and the chieftains there. So yes, I would say that that's absolutely, because they are the ones that go to the Althing and they can speak at the Althing and represent people at the Althing. And I think the other point that you made, that they are like lawyers, that's so important, because first of all, yes, you need to know the law, and you need to know what words to use. You need to know what to do. And again, it matters when you do these things. So everything has to be done in the right order, with the right words, at the right time as well. This is, for example, that's really clear, for example, in Iceland, in the Graugar's law, and this kind of see how you can see during the day. And it says, like, when the sun hits, that particular mountain, that's when oaths should be taken. And then when you do something else, you move on to a different place, and that's at a different time. And, if things are done in the wrong way, or if the wrong words are spoken, everything can just collapse. That's it. That's gone. So yeah, you need that person, you need that expert who really can do it. But that also then, going back to the point about the chieftain, that also makes it more of an elite thing, because you need to be aware of these aspects, otherwise you're not going to succeed.
Aren't they doing like a religious element as well, as sort of kind of when they start these public assemblies, in some sense, kind of consecrating some sort of sacred ground where all this would be, I don't know, what's our equivalent to that? Like, putting your hand on the Bible and taking an oath or something. I mean, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because the modern court is in a building, so we know where the boundaries are. You enter into the court building, and you probably feel it, because they're quite powerful buildings, aren't they? They're impressive. The architecture is striking, and you feel quite small. And then you sit there, and the judges and everything's around you, and it's all quite ritual. I think it's in a way quite similar. The big difference is that they're outside and at a place where they usually people meet, but then you need to sort of demarcate the boundaries of the assembly, because there are like certain laws apply within the assembly area and others outside. So you need to know where the boundaries are, and you also need to know when the assembly has started. So thinking about Iceland again, I mean, because the Icelandic Graugar's law is really detailed when it comes to like how the Althing worked. But it says that people need to be arriving kind of the night before. You mustn't be too late. And then when they start, they have this procession, and they walk round the boundaries. So the lawman and the Christian, in Christian time you'd have bishop or whatever, and they walk around the boundaries, and that sets out the boundaries of the assembly. You know what's inside, you know what's outside, and when that procession has concluded, that is when the assembly peace applies. That means no violence. If you are going to kind of bring weapons up or have a really serious discussion, you need to leave the assembly and go outside and do that there. So the purpose of that is to set the assembly peace, and it makes it this very kind of sacred space where no violence should be committed.
I've recently been re-exploring the Norse myths because I recently finished another podcast with Ian Stewart Sharp, and his Norse mythology knowledge is just so incredible, and I'm just like, and I need to revisit. I haven't revisited in a long time. But one of the things that was in it, I'm doing the Neil Gaiman one, just for full disclosure, and it's I got to the part where they're engaging the human who ends up being a giant to build the wall around Asgard to protect it, and then he makes a deal where he has to finish it in a season, and then if he does, then he'll get, I think, Freya as his wife and the sun and the moon. Fun story. One of the key things, and Terry, you made me think of this when you said putting the hand on the Bible to swear, like we have. One of the things they mentioned in there was once they made the deal, then they swore uh, on all these different objects, a whole bunch of different ones, including Odin's arm ring, his spear. I forget, it starts with a G. So is that something that's reflected in the actual law codes that they would take certain objects that had value and then swear upon them?
I don't think they swore upon them exactly, not in the same way as we would with the Bible, but yes, I would say that key objects were really important. And for various reasons, there are oath rings are known, for example. We see them they're mentioned in the sources. And there's one potential oath ring that's preserved, and that's from Frossa Church in northern Sweden. So they found quite, I don't know how long ago, but maybe 100 years ago or something, on the church door there was this big ring, and they just always it was always there, and they looked at it, and there was a runic inscription, and it dates from the 9th century, and is like the earliest law from Scandinavia. And so it's written in runes, but it's about this size. And that may well be an oath ring, so that people hold, perhaps we don't really know how it works, but holding this object and then swearing an oath, maybe being before speaking at the assembly or going into an agreement with somebody, for example. But I also think that there are other objects that were really important. So, for example, if you're selling land, this is also seen in the Frankish laws, that you handed over a stick to somebody. And I think, again, this is because it's outside, it's public, and people can't necessarily hear what's being said, but they can see it. Like if you're at a wedding, you can follow the ceremony even if you don't hear everything, because it's very visual in that sense. So it's, in a way, it's a bit like a play. It's being played out in front of people, so that they can say afterwards, well, I saw that, Thor took the stick from Björn, so we know that he now owns the land because he received the stick, and the stick symbolizes the land, for example. Or they held the oath ring, we saw them, they swore the oath. So those objects, I think, are really, really important.
This is really interesting, because now it's got my wheels turning, where I'm like, so there's a certain theatrical nature to this, where
Yeah.
there is a process, and there's a kind of a rehearsed, and you have to do it in front of everybody, because you don't think about that, but they're not writing anything down. So how do you prove it? Well, you get an audience and you make a big show of it. That's really fun. I'm gonna write that down somewhere, and
Oh, good. You can come and go into a book.
yeah, that's going to come out in future books. Just like, Hastings goes out in front of it. Well, I mean, he already kind of does that. He does very public shows of violence to kind of assert his dominance over people, because he's kind of ferocious in certain ways. And then, so I mean, there's something there. But this is really interesting, because I now I'm imagining more like, what was funny is I gave a talk on longships at OMSI a couple of years ago. And somebody asked me, what's the most historically accurate show on the Vikings? And I said, Norseman, the one from
The Norwegian one.
yeah,
The parody.
the
Yeah.
parody, the joke, right?
Right?
And what's wonderful is, yeah, okay, they're not super historically accurate, but they do bring in elements and then use them for comedic purposes. And when you look at like Hollywood and all the other, video productions about the Vikings, they're all terrible. It's a really low bar. So Norseman kind of lives in that, but they kind of do that, right? Where they make fun of some of what they do is very theatrical. In fact, they have a guy who comes in, I think that's in season 1, where they try to put on a play.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's that way, we know, right? All the way through life, right? I mean, because Neil Price has talked quite a bit about, sort of the performative nature of like the burial process and ritual and all of that. And then the sort of continual sort of re-engagement even after it's over with the burial site and stuff. So yeah, I mean, it is interesting to think about, because it just sort of reminds you like how much of an oral culture this is. And so then you have to do that, right? Everything is visual. It's through action and images. And then that's how, when like with the law speaker, right? We haven't even talked about the law speaker, which is totally amazing. Like this dude who gets elected by his fellow chieftains, and then has to stand up there and like recite 1/3 of the laws from memory, like every year for 3 years running. And so, I always sort of think it's interesting to think about that guy and then be like, how can we fact check that guy? Like, yeah, or
That's it. I mean, he has the power. He has the most power because yeah, if he misses out the laws that he misses out, they're no longer law. And like oral tradition, he can tweak the laws, however he kind of wants. And that's the way they've always been, there's no discussion about that. So yeah, it's insane.
Or it's like, well, it's sort of now like dovetailing in with your other interests. Is sort of like when Thorgeir gets the job to like decide as the law speaker whether or not Iceland is going to become Christian.
Yeah.
I mean that's a powerful thing, and yet this person technically is not an executive of any kind, like we would think of that in our modern
Mhm.
time. So um, but so I wanted to ask you then a question. Okay, so in my hypothetical thing where I'm like engaging my chieftain to come and help me with this problem I have with my neighbor, and then we all like sort of, all right, we negotiate and he helps us come to a conclusion and we shake hands on it or whatever, we spit and shake hands or whatever they do. And okay, so then what? Who enforces that
Yeah,
engagement?
that's the big problem, isn't it? Because there's no executive power, there's no police force, and there's no prison, there's none of that. So you have to do it yourself. So you need if somebody then decided that you are owed a big fine, for example, somebody's done something to you, you're owed a big fine. So they say, okay, that's it. But then you need to go and collect it yourself. And then you obviously need powerful people and people with weapons who can go and ride over to that farm and demand payment. The church laws, or this, the Christian parts of the laws, that's when they sometimes then they do have the bishop can come along and help enforce payment of fines. But secular laws, there's none of that, and you just have to do it yourself.
Well, so, but I'm in this kind of, what we know of this pretty honor coded kind of society, right? And like you were just saying
Mhm.
with the oath ring and whatever, I mean, so
Yeah.
your word is supposed to be your bond, right? So wouldn't it make somebody kind of lose face if they didn't live up to what was very publicly agreed?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If you're an honourable person, and many people maybe were, probably they're always bad apples, aren't there? Who are not going to do it.
Humans, wherever we are, there we are. God.
Exactly, exactly.
Ah, okay. All right.
Yeah,
So
so this is where we're lacking stuff, of course. Sorry, but
yeah.
we've got the laws, and then all the practical, what actually happened. Then we don't have that. So that's what we have to leave that to our imaginations, really.
But
Yeah.
that's like when we talked with William Short and Rainer Oskarsson, and they did the whole house burning experiments because we know from the Icelandic sagas that burning people alive in their houses was an honorable thing to do, which we
From
were like,
somebody's viewpoint.
yeah,
Yeah.
from our viewpoint today, we're like, that's atrocious.
That's
And
cool, man.
yeah, and then Rainer was just like, no, it's totally fair. It's and but yeah, kind of like that. Like how do you police that? And that's kind of you think of gangs of people who just decide, well, I think the American South may have had a close, with the Ku
Mhm.
Klux Klan and their lynchings. I mean, that's kind of
Yeah.
a similar system where they decide on a law, then it wouldn't be a law as recognized by the state, but for them, in their little core group, and then they take action based on that. It just kind of makes it a scary place to live, doesn't it?
Well, isn't that like just vigilante justice then,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
Quote unquote justice.
That's almost what we're talking about, right? Like it's because in Iceland, with those law codes, we're talking about small groups of people. These are not large accumulations of people, so you would be kind of small, right? I mean, if we're really drilling into it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like for some reason, I can't remember where I got it now, but between when Iceland was settled in the 870s and then the 930, when they start this all thing process, that there's something on the order of like maybe 10 or 20,000 inhabitants of Iceland. So I mean, it's not too small,
Yeah,
but
for back then, that's actually pretty sizable. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
and didn't you have some kind of like, I don't know if the right word is legal responsibility or whatever, but there was some kind of, people were like mandated to show up to these things, weren't they? Or you had to pay a fine if you weren't going to
Yeah,
show
yeah,
up.
yeah, definitely. I mean, so there are like different types of assemblies or things. So there's local ones for a district, and that would wherever they're called, that varies between Iceland and Norway, Denmark, Sweden. But so like in Scandinavia, you have versions of what's called a herad. So that's the local district, and they will have one thing. And they're kind of our things in the sense that everybody can be there and everybody's kind of encouraged to be there. And I think there is a responsibility to be there because again, this is for conflict resolution and for decision making. And then there's like always higher up as well. So every law area, like all of Iceland, will have their own thing. And then in Scandinavia, you've got the law provinces, and they will have their big assembly. And the provinces are pretty big, but they then have representatives for the areas, just like the Althing in Iceland, where they go to the Althing. So they have representatives that are sent to the assembly to speak for the area, and they are absolutely required by law to be there. And it's really, in Norway, it's really super well regulated, and it says that every area is listed, and it said so and so many representatives should travel to the thing, and they get reimbursed like travel expenses, like food and butter and whatever to go along the way. And then in the later laws, they've kind of reduced the number of representatives a little bit. So kind of suggests to us maybe there was a bit tricky to get people to travel all the way to the assembly and actually be there. But yeah, there's absolutely a requirement and an expectation that they should be there. And I think people were expected to have knowledge of law and to engage in the system.
So when you say they, to me, then in my little analogy that I'm using, where I keep saying I'm in a conflict with somebody, how would that go down in this system if it's a woman who needs legal help, or is there such thing as a thing woman?
Yeah.
Okay. So where are they in this?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, yeah. So the first, let's start with what you just said there, thing woman. The term that appears in the laws then of the people who are, should go to the assembly or have the right to be at the thing, that's the thing man or thing mother. And that's the Old Norse mother, which is always translated as man. As in a male person, like the laws, if you read through them, it's all it's all he and him and man. But in Old Norse, mother is actually human, and so it's used for both men and women. So it's a bit misleading when it says thing man, because everybody automatically thinks it's only a man. I mean, of course, the majority were men, I'm sure, but how you qualified to the assembly, and you could actually represent yourself then, is that if you're a landowner, and you can't have like a tiny bit of land, but if you have odal land, the land that's inherited within the family, and they're sizable chunks of land, then that gives you the right to actually vote at the assembly, and if you need, represent yourself. You don't have to represent yourself, but you can. And that is then men or women. And I had this kind of playing around with figures a little bit to try and work out how many women could we even envisage being there. And this is just like trying to work it out. And I was looking at rune stones from Scandinavia or from Sweden, where there's many rune stones erected by women, and it's been suggested then that the women who could erect rune stones were also running the farm, and that's another, if you run the farm, then you're allowed to go to the assembly as well. So they own land and they run the farm, And that's about 8% of runestones. So you say, okay, maybe you have about 10% female landowners because, men die, right? As well. So there are plenty of widows. And then there are other roles as well. So when women can take part in the assemblies, I was suggesting like a figure that could potentially be 10% of women that had the right to be at the assembly. Then whether they wanted to be there and they actually did go there, I think depends very much on who they were. Were they elite women, if they had high standing, like, think of like Pakistan, they've had female leaders, for example, which seems really bizarre, but because they belong to the right family, they have that power. And I think we can see something similar in the Viking Age. And then going back to what you said as well, Terry, do you have the knowledge? Do you have the vocabulary? Do you know what to do? So yeah, both men and women is my conclusion.
So both men and women, but probably generally at any given time, a smaller percentage of women. And that when you read the laws, at least in my understanding of it, in the broad brush of it, you should be getting a sense of this is a culture that does not give a ton of public power to women. It's mostly reserved for men.
It's mostly reserved for men, definitely. But I think it reads it. I think it's important to remember that the mother then is for everybody. And when sometimes they specify, they have other words, and when they specify, they really mean this really means men. This really means women. And also something that's been shown, like Else Mundal, for example, the Norwegian historian, and she's compared the Icelandic and the Norwegian laws, and she's shown that the Icelandic laws are much stricter when it comes to women in public positions and everything. So whether that's a development over time or whether Christianity made it more difficult, but there's a clear difference between women in sort of public places and at the assembly as well, between the Norwegian laws and the Icelandic one.
Well, speaking of Christianity, I have a kind of broad stroke question.
Yeah.
That I don't know if we can kind of try to answer it, but it might be a little bit too broad stroke. But I had a thought about how this is, you have these assemblies, the thing, and then during Christianization, one of the things that was a prominent feature of that was the reorganization of society into a more hierarchical organization, consolidation of power, and so forth. Would it be, may I suggest that the Christianization of Scandinavia may have been a cyclical part of that cyclical phenomenon, kind of like I forget the Greek philosopher who proposed it, but what is it called? Anacyclosis, which is basically how everything cycles over, and so you start with anarchy, and then it turns to autocracy and everything, right? And so basically they ended up with democracy, and then the democracy turned into autocracy, and then that's kind of what allowed Christianity to come in, right? I mean, I'm just thinking out loud, like could this almost be fit in as part of that model?
Interesting. I don't know, but it's clear. I mean, there are clear differences with when Christianity comes in the sense that the kings become so powerful, and then larger areas are brought together, and you've got bishoprics as well, and they also bring the kingdoms together. And what is very clear actually is that the assembly becomes much less powerful within Christianity. Its importance decreases a lot, and people have less influence because the kings gradually grab all this power. They in the end. So in the 13th century laws, when we start having the laws of the land, that like one law, or sort of one law for Norway, one law for Sweden, and for the whole kingdom, rather than having these provincial laws, then the king makes himself the ultimate judge. But before that, if you go further back in time, there is no one judge. There is only the law speaker or the lawman, and they interpret the law, but they don't really make decisions. Then you have like a group of people coming together to discuss, and they then provide a verdict. It's not one person, it's a group of people. It's really not until the lawman becomes the sole, the kind of the judge. And that's also sort of like this quite late, perhaps 12th century. And then you've got the king going, oh, but I'm the ultimate judge. So you do see a decrease in sort of democracy, if you like, with the introduction of Christianity.
Or at least consensus type of decision making.
Yes, but
Yeah,
and also because the when you go through the Middle Ages, then the thing, it survives in Scandinavia, but the local ones, the herad assemblies, like I talked about earlier, they become courts only, local courts, and the whole parliamentary function that was there earlier, that goes to the king.
Yeah, because it almost becomes a chicken and egg sort of thing. So like a modern analogy that I could maybe throw out there is going to sound really implausible, but you think about kind of the breakdown of norms and laws over time, going back to the idea that the law speaker can kind of just make up whatever. And so, you get so kind of over time, there's a breakdown, and then that breakdown of the norms and the laws opens the door to Christianity to come in and help reorganize, or chieftains utilizing it? Or was it that Christianity came in and was the disruptor that then caused all of that, right? And so like the modern analogy I'm thinking of is like in the US right now, where our norms are being obliterated and the rule of law isn't being followed as strictly as before. And then imagine that our president just decided tomorrow to say, well, all of a sudden I'm Muslim and we're going to do a theocracy, right? And in this scenario, it's the breakdown of norms and laws that then lead to this phenomenon, right? The Muslimification of the United States. Is that what happened? Or was it that the religion came in and was the disruptor? That's an interesting kind of chicken and egg kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And you have written at length about the Christianization of Scandinavia. Yeah.
Yes, I have. Well, I think that religion kind of gradually cracked in and then just became, in the end, it's like, well, all right, then this is what we do type thing. So I think that what you suggested there, like Donald Trump would just go, right, okay, we're all Muslim now, is exactly how it didn't happen. But more because there was an awareness of Christianity over a long period of time, and even the people, and they knew Christians, they had met Christians, and maybe some people had converted, but then there was a gradual sort of just building up knowledge of that, and I think that leads up to the general acceptance and conversion, and also in the end, Scandinavia's a bit of an outlier there. Everyone else was Christians, so in the end, just kind of like that's what happens.
Versus I'm thinking of the Civil War, the dispute between Harold Clack and his brother Hork, and then Harold Clack converted to Christianity, right? But that was for a different purpose, as to get allies on the fight. But I mean, that is a breakdown of law and order, right? Because there's that dispute, they get into a fight, then he goes and he's like, I'm Christian now, and everybody who follows me has to be Christian. And it didn't really work that way though, because he didn't really become Christian. It was just he was trying to get the Carolingians to help him.
Yeah, the good old prima signatio, right? Yeah, I'm a Christian, right? Good. All right, are we good to go now? Can we whatever? Yeah, right. How many? Because even Eleanor, remember, she talked about that on our podcast with her, where it's like the stories of how many times these Viking chieftains or whatever would show up to like just get baptized again, for the fancy robes or whatever.
Yeah, to get the free robes. Yeah. And then
then when they start running out of the really fancy robes, then they're like bitching, like, hey, what's this one? It's got stains on it or whatever, like they're just there for the prizes, But it's true. And actually, like Anders Winroth, who was on the podcast before too, talking about Christianization, I think he sums it up pretty well, where you get some of these guys on the make in Scandinavia, right? And his power is consolidating. And then if you sort of pop your head up and look around the world and be like, all right, who are the most powerful dudes in the world? Well, they're all Christian to those people, right? So it's kind of like, all right, I guess I need to do that, so. Yeah. It's not like these guys were like taking Jesus into their heart,
No, I mean, I'm sure some people did as well. But yes, it's absolutely like a political decision. And, there was these rules, you need to be Christian to trade with others. All right. Okay. Then that's quite handy then. And yeah, if you want to be part of the gang type thing, then you need to be a Christian. I think that was the situation in the end. So yeah, loads of politics in
So
that.
when we marry these two things, as far as like political systems and law and order, and then a religious system like Christianity, which was Catholicism at that time, coming in there. Oh, now I just lost my train of thought. Darn it, I hate it when that happens.
Oh,
Uh, Arg.
I have a question if you want to think
Go
about it.
for it. Go for
Okay,
it.
I just want to just for for the enjoyment of going through some of these, what are some of the stranger laws that you've encountered that say something
Yeah.
that say something, you know, kind of like one of my favorites from the medieval period is in Wales. It was there was a law specifically that said that you would lose a hand if you fornicated with a sheep, which tells you a lot about Wales at the time. So you know, so what do we have from the Viking Age that gives us clues as to like what's going on?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think one of my favorite laws is from the Christian laws in Norway. And I think it's a Gulathing law, Gulafrossathing law. I can't remember offhand. So these laws are very clearly like from a phase when you are trying to make people be Christians, like talking about what is a Christian and how do you become a Christian? And for them, they don't tell people to go to church because they didn't, there were not enough churches. But it was all about, how you and what you do in your everyday life. And for example, fasting was really, really important. There were many days of fasting and different types of food on different types of days. Really complicated. And of course, the Christian calendar comes with this as well. And so there's a law that says that so on Fridays, of course, you're not meant to eat, or it depends on the type of Friday, but really in general. And so if you're, definitely not meant to eat meat, but so if it's a Friday and you're on your own in the forest and you forget that it's a Friday, well, that's okay because you're on your own. And how would you know? So if you eat meat on a Friday, that's okay. And if there's two of you and you both forget that it's Friday, well, that's okay too. But if there's 3 or 4 or more of you, then it's impossible that all of you have forgotten that it is Friday, and therefore you cannot eat meat because that will be punishable then by a fine, and you need to do penance.
So then we can imagine that somebody did this where there was a whole group of maybe 12 guys out in the forest and they ate meat on a Friday.
Yeah.
And then when they're back, the law speaker looks at them and says, "One of you must have remembered that it was a Friday."
Like, no. Yeah, and then I think they add on, I can't remember the same chapter or another chapter, but also if it's Friday and somebody gives you food and you take it and you feel that it is meat and it is Friday, then you must spit it out.
Wasn't there is a famous story in, I think, one of the sagas, right? Where the king of Norway had converted, but then they were trying to get him to eat meat soup or something. And they finally, he's like, no. And then they're like, okay, how about a little bit of the broth? And he's like, nope, still got meat in it, And then they're like, what did they like finally, like, you just smell the vapors of it or something like
That's
that. And
right.
he kind of agreed to do that, but it was just like, no, I can't do it. Yeah, I mean, the other one, the laws that I point out to my students, actually, I mean, interestingly, are the laws that prohibit men, at least in the Gragas, prohibit like men and women from like dressing like the opposite sex or, engaging in anything that's sort of behavior. Like, some of my students are always like, oh, they're gender fluid. I'm like, oh, I don't know. No, I think they kind of tried hard not to be.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
There's that grave find from I think 900 or 1,000 years ago from Finland where they found weapons, but also female clothing, and then they did an analysis of the bones and it showed that the person had Klinefelter syndrome, which is the extra X chromosome, and then so there's indications to say that this person was male, but then developed female features, and then kind of embraced it and wore female clothing. And this was an important person because they were buried with all of this stuff. So there's somebody who had some kind of status in the community. But then the study authors come out and say, a gender non-binary Viking. And I'm like, but that's our term. That's our cultural phenomenon, not their, like what, and it's total clickbait, bait. And I saw it again yesterday on a Facebook post, and somebody shared it, the non-binary Viking. And because and so then I went on there and put a comment and said, wait, no. We can't be transposing our cultural things onto people from the past. We don't really know. And that's not how they would have said or whatever. And now you've given me more firepower because I can say there were laws that said that what this person did were bad, right? But they were in Finland, so they got a pass apparently. And they, but then I said this is pure clickbait, which is exactly why I wrote about it on my blog too. With the
Yeah.
title non-binary, right?
Yeah, you know that old Carol Clover article from the 90s about sex and
Yeah.
gender, right? And I think she does a really I assign that to my students because I think she does a really good job of sort of explaining, these ideas about it's less about sex and gender than it is about these other characteristics of personality, right? And stuff like that. And then but it is like this sort of everybody's sort of being measured up to the male scale, as I call it, right? Or what she calls the one sex model. And again, my students will read it and go, oh, they were gender fluid. I'm like, no, they were the opposite. They wanted everybody to be male and masculine, regardless of who you were. It's like those were the preferred qualities of a human being, in all regards. So yeah, I also, all right. So actually, before I forget again, I did remember where my train of
Oh,
thought was. And that was just to ask you the question of like when you have the marriage of these two things of a political sort of legal judicial system and then Christianity, does that make it look like medieval Europe at the time was a theocracy?
yes. Yes. It's so close. I mean, they are absolutely so close together, and I think that the Viking Age assembly, had the Old Norse religion intertwined with it, and had so it was basically law and religion are were the same. Absolutely.
People have a difficult time understanding that, I think, at least in the West, where we have enshrined, separation of church and state. They just sort of don't understand how that works or why the church would be a political player. It's like, damn, the church is one of the biggest political players in that period of time, man. You ever heard of the Crusades? Like, that happens at the end of the Viking Age.
Not only that, but what's the first kingdom? What's the first kingdom to join the crusade?
I don't know.
Denmark.
Oh.
Right? They're like, oh, we're Christian now. We can't go around and raid and pillage.
Yeah, yeah.
It's all over. We're so bored. This is no more fun. And then the Pope's just like, we need to go to the Middle East. And they're like, really? We're in.
Oh, yeah. Well, there is a Viking Crusade, like in the early 1100s. I know. King Sigurd of Norway, I think, is one of those that takes part. But
Oh, yeah, it's meant to. It said that he has said he's going to set off on a crusade. Yeah, and then the Danes go, go east to Livonia and all of that. They're crusading there as well later on. So, yeah.
Yeah.
so, what is it that's interesting to you about this law and order stuff?
I think it's interesting because the overall idea is chaos and violence, isn't it? Really, and raiding and all of that. And I came across it quite early on when I was still a student, and first of all I wanted to write about the assembly sites, and I have an MA essay that I wrote on assemblies. I think it was like 5,000 words or something. And I found that not so long ago. And about that time, I kind of pulled together what was known about the actual assembly sites. It was very little. And then I kind of abandoned the idea, and then I went off and did Christianization for my PhD. But then while I was working on Christianization, and it was quite hard because I was trying to find an angle that hadn't really been covered before in terms of Christianization. And there was a lot, it was a very popular topic at the time. So then I kind of fell into the laws and I realized how important they were. And I saw that, as we talked about already as well, like, the decisions to convert, they were made at the assembly a lot of the time. And I started reading the laws, and I thought, and then the assembly sites came back into focus for me as well. So that's how I sort of fell into it, then I realized they had this massive regulating effect, and that nobody had looked at it, and that there were all these sites scattered all over, like Scandinavia, Iceland, Scotland, etc. And people didn't know anything about them. We couldn't even barely find them. So that was my kind of my challenge.
Yes, and so now people can read about them in this book. Great.
That's it.
I mean, you are a trained archaeologist, so being, site driven rather than always just text driven like us boring old historians. That, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, but like the nature of it, as we're talking, I mean, it lends itself to studying the sites because these were not written cultures at the time when most of this was happening, at least in the earlier parts of the Viking Age. And so the archaeology is really what you have, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think my first goal really was to try and locate as many sites as possible, and I managed to kind of work out a methodology on how to find them with like place names and archaeology and reading the landscape, topography, and then I just visited as many sites as possible. And then, in the end, you kind of get a feel for what they're like. But then once I had done that, then I realized, that there are these very, very clear patterns to what they look like. And by then interpreting those patterns, you start thinking, how were the sites used? And then you it gives some insight into how law then, was practiced.
Yeah, because that makes me think when you say that. I mean, it's like, and I've been out to, Thinkfedler a million times. I love it, that place. But if I'm just an ordinary tourist and I don't know anything about Viking Age history or anything like that, I mean, I'd be out there like, okay, this is really cool geology and it's a really pretty place and whatever. But like, there's nothing here that screams to me public court assembly, kind of stuff. And then, I suppose something else maybe like monumental wise. I mean, it's like you're not walking up onto like Stonehenge or something and it's like, whoa, something's happening here. So like, how do you even know? How did you even know when you were like in the place and are like, okay, this is it? What's there telling you that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we don't know. I mean, Thinkfedler is so interesting. You said it's so beautiful, and in terms of geology, it's super special. There you would have all the booths, of course, in Iceland, and possible other indicators too. Like from Scandinavia, we know that they erected like rune stones, roads with like standing stones leading up to the assemblies. There would be burials. A lot of the time, these sites, especially the big provincial assembly sites, they are focused around big burial mounds. And the burials, they can go back to like 100 AD or something. So that, people have been burying there for a long time. So they are important sites, for the community. But also then erecting carved pillars, for example, and having processional routes. So they were pretty, I think when you got to this site, you would know that this is it now. I'm here now. This were the big mounds, these are the pillars. I follow the road, the stones, everything leads up to here. Now I'm just like when you arrive at the court building, these days, you knew when you were there. Absolutely.
Okay, but I mean, so that's for somebody who was back then, but like, I mean, like you now to research these sites. I mean, you're just like out in some farmer's field, like, okay, is this it? Like, I mean, how do you know?
Yeah, it really varies because some of them, yes, you are in a field and you're like, okay. Where were they? Were they over there, over here? No idea. But other sites are quite well preserved. And we can kind of work with them and reconstruct them. Like Anundshög, one of the sites that I've been sort of excavating with colleagues from, many seasons, already before we had done any excavation there, there is like one of the biggest burial mounds in Sweden. There is a beautiful, really like 2-3 meter tall rune stone. There are standing stones. There are hollow roads leading into the site. It's absolutely striking. And then, of course, what we're trying to do is work out what else was there. And there, we know that now that they had an absolutely massive row of wooden posts that were erected sort of like every 2 meters over at least 200 meters long stretch along the site. And, the post holes are massive. So we're probably talking really, really big wooden pillars. And I can imagine they would have been painted, carved, etc. And it's weird. The dating is a bit difficult to work out, but it does seem that there was a linear monument, like of the erected wooden posts from 600 to like 1200 AD.
Wow.
So there was a need to keep this monument. So they probably kept replacing pillars, kept adding to that monument because that's the route that leads into the site. So it's kind of the entrance into the site, and what also delimits the site. You need to talk about the site boundaries as well. So obviously there was a need over several hundreds of years to have that kind of monument at the site, and maybe the actual practicalities around it changed a little bit, but they kept building that same monument over time.
Wow. Yeah, the continuity matters a lot, right? I guess, and that's why, with the burials as well, right? Sort of this connection to the past.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And if you're going to practice law, and if you're going to have make decisions that are valid, they need to be made, in the right place, in the place of power. Is again, I keep talking about this, but you go to Parliament and that's where decisions are made. You don't go to the industrial estate and have new laws or political decisions issued. You remember that? Who was that? Was it Donald Trump who had like this failed press conference and they booked the wrong place? Mm-hmm. And they ended up in some like car park somewhere. I think it might have been him. But and journalists turned up and like, what is this? And then they just left in the end because there was nothing happened, because that place it had no significance.
They didn't get the memo. Yeah. Well, so like, I'm thinking like you just did the Parliament, and I'm thinking, like years ago, I used to like to whatever, a C-SPAN or one of these channels, right, where you could watch, what is it called, Question Time in the Parliament, where it gets like, pretty raucous. But there's it's tight shot, right? And so you're just looking at, like the PM maybe taking hits or whatever, but then like whoever, the constituents on either side. But I couldn't get a sense of like if there's, because in the US you can go to the Senate building and you can like sit up in like the bleachers or whatever that are up above and like watch the proceedings going on down on the floor, like you would like a performance of some kind, And so I'm imagining it's like they like make the sacred space out at the all thing, and then like are there people, sort of in the cheap seats like drinking ale and eating popcorn and watching the laws be made, or like how does the rest of the community who's just there sort of as the families who went along for this, the summer vacation, like are they there like watching what's happening also?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, obviously, probably depends. Some parts may be more interesting than others. But yeah, I think they were definitely there, especially for a place. Again, think about the Althing in Iceland, because that is then a week long assembly. It's a long time. But is that people, at least people are taking part in the assembly. They need to be there for the duration. That's the law. But also, it's a pretty big place and quite a lot of people, but this is the time to meet others, isn't it, and resolve and arrange marriages and just general chat and socialize and do all these things. So I think that they are all there, and for the important decisions, I'm sure people listened, and those who could vote did do that, by raise of hands or weapons or whatever. But I'm sure it would have been a really lively place with lots and lots going on.
Was there public execution?
Well, that's a good question. I think so, but we don't quite know, because there are so few crimes that were punishable by death. Very, very few. It's really outlawry. That's the main form of punishment. But there are some laws that say that if somebody commits murder at the assembly, then it can be executed on the spot. And I'm also wondering whether like really powerful chieftains or kings in Scandinavia, whether they executed people at the assembly, but that was something that they could do. but nobody else. It wasn't like a common thing, but for particularly bad crimes. If you really want to show power, that's what you do, isn't it?
Yeah.
It seems like one of the modern pop culture obsessions is with the blood eagle and
Yeah.
how it was this gruesome execution. And here we're talking about, well, most things weren't punishable by death. You would just be outlawed. And I'm thinking specifically too, I always wondered about this. Eric the Red, right?
Yeah.
Leif Erikson's father, and he was outlawed in Norway for committing murder, and then outlawed in Iceland for again committing murder. So obviously, yeah, they weren't super into public execution. So that kind of dismisses a little bit the blood eagle, right? Like
Yeah.
that improbable practice because legally speaking, they didn't execute people; they just kicked them out.
Yeah, they kick them out, and then if you're an outlaw, yeah, you can be killed.
Yeah.
And that's kind of it. Tough luck then if you're killed. Yeah, there are some interesting discussions about the blood eagle, and there are like how some to people, to academics, one take completely different views, and there's like kind of an argument going on, like 2 or 3 articles that follow on each other about whether the blood eagle was something that was actually practiced or not. But I don't think so. To me, it just seems completely made up, and it's something that nothing like that in the laws whatsoever. I think is much more simplistic, like outlawed for a period of time, or you could be outlawed forever, but that's the really harsh punishment then.
I
Yeah,
actually put, oh,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I put that in my latest book. It's on the editor's desk, but
Oh, yeah.
there's a scene toward the end where they're trying to get information out of somebody, and they come up with this plan of saying, well, what if we do a blood eagle? And half the guys there don't even know what that is. And then they say, and then the one of the characters basically tells the main character, like, well, what if this guy calls your bluff? He's like, well, we'll have to make something up because we don't know. Like, it's not real. It's just a story our parents told us when we were children.
Yes. Oh, I love that.
The outlaw thing, the full outlaw thing, I mean, people don't understand the complete gravity of that when you live in a culture like that where, good luck when you're shunned basically and nobody can feed you or clothe you or anything else. I mean, survival was hard enough in a community, let alone trying to do it on your own, where people could like still had immunity if they found you and killed you, right? I mean, they don't even yeah. So
Yeah.
it's basically it's a death sentence in and of itself. I always tell my students it's like to get them to sort of understand the sort of analogy is cancel culture nowadays. I mean, not like somebody's going to die from cancel culture, but it is like this reputational hit, right? That could be pretty severe and unrecoverable on some level, but that it's still in lots of communities or cultures even still to this day, but throughout human history, it is why sort of banishment and shunning is such an important tool, right? I mean, humans are social beings, and then when you add to that, you can survive more easily within a community. It really is a harsh punishment to just say you need to go over there for a while and not come back.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you survive on your own?
No.
You just may have inspired a new blog post for me that'll say, the Vikings had cancel culture, question mark. and then talk about outlawry, right, as the general practice.
Yes, they did. And then you have to weave in there the utter importance of reputation in the Viking Age, and then you'll see why it matters, right?
Yeah. Reputation is everything.
That's exactly it. So,
Absolutely.
well, then what's next for you? What are you working on now?
So at the moment, I'm working a lot on Scotland, actually, and the Viking Age settlement in Scotland, looking at harbours, communication, sailing routes, trying to figure out how places were connected in Scotland, and having some excavations as well, and really generally studying use and access of the sea, which is really interesting and takes me somewhere else, which is also good.
Yeah, something new and exciting.
Yeah. But there are assembly sites there as well, so I'm not going to get away from them.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming. I mean, it's just so interesting. I mean, I could talk about the laws forever. And again, we sort of, as we started, sort of debunking the sort of myth of, these knuckle dragger people who all just live to kill each other. I mean, I do, and maybe I'm just sort of rose-colored glasses, but I do sort of have this feeling of them having at least a tiny bit of self-awareness that they knew if they didn't just try to live in accordance with some kind of law that, it's all just going to go off the rails, right? And nobody wants that. So, law and order, Viking law and order.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right.
Great.
Well,
Well, thanks for being on the show. This was really
yeah,
interesting.
really interesting.
Thank you. Well, I hope it inspire some writing. I'm looking forward to some blog posts and books. That sounds great.
Yeah. Should be fun.
It will. Yes. All right.